It's so much better if you just learn about the people who live in the city that you live in and get to know them. And you don't have to celebrate their culture, but how cool is it to know their culture and to know what it's about and stuff like that?
You just heard John Doyle, the executive director of the Rock and Soul Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. John is a white Memphian son who has worked in the music industry since the 80s. In this episode, he talks with our host Jean about how racism is a behavior that can be unlearned, the importance of speaking up as an ally, and the effects of historical inequality in the music industry. Let's jump right in.
I want to hear from you because I know you being in the broadcast business before, you were marketing, and now you're in the music side of the museum. How did you detect in my voice that I'm African American?
That's a great question. To tell you the truth, I don't know. It makes you ponder the question, what makes someone sound African American? Would you be able to tell that I'm a white person? It'd be a great discussion point among people while we determine those things, conclusions that we draw about people and why we draw those conclusions. And I've had big discussions as well, Gene, about the difference between prejudice and racism. That makes no sense to me. I think it's the same thing. And I go all the way back to when I worked at WHRK Radio here in Memphis, which was the #1 station for years. WHRK sister station, WDA, the first African-American station. We think it's the first African-American station in the country. And when I say African-American station, specifically programming to an African-American audience, which hadn't been done before. And there's some great discussion in the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum about Rufus Thomas saying the owners, who were white owners, decided we just spoke on the microphones. And he recalls learning on the weekends how to use all the equipment in the radio station, because then he could really feel like it was his radio station speaking to people who were like him.
That opening statement that you made, I mean, that's priceless, because one reason why I wanted to include you on the podcast is you are like a everyman in my mind. Like the year that I've known you, you really empathize with the African-American, the Black experience. And reading your bio that I read on the website, you seem to have made a conscious decision, like at some point in your life, to want to know Black people better.
I think it's because of where I grew up. I live in Memphis, Tennessee. It's 65% people of color. I went to a neighborhood school in 7th grade, and then in 8th grade and 9th grade, I was bused across town to junior high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was pretty much 50-50, Black and white. Little Rock being diverse, similar to Memphis, not quite as diverse as Memphis. And there's long stories about Memphis's diversity and being a majority Black city that goes all the way to the yellow plague epidemics of the late 1800s, because whites fled the city because folks were dying by the droves, and Blacks stayed here and maintained the city. And so we became a predominantly Black city at that time. I had relatives. I had an aunt who said, my kids will never go to school with Blacks. She used to chastise me because when I went to college, I would wear shorts to class, just because in college, you just do what you do and the professor doesn't really care. And so we discussed this one time when I was visiting my aunt and uncle. And she said, you should dress like business attire when you go to college classes, because college is preparing you for the real world. And in the real world, you can't wear shorts everywhere. You need to dress up. And I said to her, not disrespectful, I had a great relationship with this aunt who's now passed away, but I said, your grandkids, who you're never going to allow to go to school with people of color, we said Black people at the time, of course, you know, in the real world, they're going to be there. And so if school is about preparing us for the real world, then when I get married and have kids, I want my kid to go to a school where it mirrors the community that I live in. I would do the same thing if I lived in Seoul, South Korea, because I'm intrigued with people and I'm intrigued with what people think. It's not always aren't I a great person that I'm exploring these things. It's just a curiosity thing to me. why we like things, don't like things. And this whole thing of us being exactly the same as a species, but so totally different because we come from different cultures. And that's not just between white and black. It's very prominent here in the United States, obviously, but it's no different than me with Latino people in Memphis, Tennessee. Why you live your life the way you do, the principles that you have, the family structure that you embrace so strong. One time here in Memphis, I went and visited a mosque. Yeah, I think it was after September 11th. I went and visited a mosque and said, I just want to know what y'all are all about, because now we're all afraid of y'all because y'all are the ones who hijacked the planes that ran in, and so we draw conclusions about them. And they, therefore, because of that one action, fell under a lot of hatred and violence in the same way that blacks have done in our country. And it sounds like a simple cliche these days, but just because of the color of your skin. But it's true. We draw conclusions. One time when I was working at K97 radio, and someone said, "Ooh, I hate a rainy day like this. And how do y'all live with it when it rains?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Because your hair smells like a wet dog when it gets wet." I had no idea. I never heard that my hair smells like a wet dog. But they said, "Oh, yeah, white people's hair just smells like a wet dog." No one has ever said to me, white people, anything, you know? That was a simple little thing. But what if those types of things are cast upon you all the time because of who you are? Oh, well, black people, y'all do this, or whatever the case might be. Are you saying that because they're black? Well, not necessarily. Well, yeah, necessarily. I don't want to bash white people, but we received privilege, and so we sometimes don't act appropriate and don't realize that we don't act appropriate. But I even remember as a kid going to visit my grandmother in Whiteville, Tennessee, and she would walk us downtown for us to go to the general store to buy candy or whatever she needed to buy. And we'd walk down an alley that went right by a cotton gin. One time we were walking down this alley and there were some blacks coming this way, and my grandmother moved and said, "I just don't like it when they brush up against me." No, but it was funny. She said, "It's almost like their color's going to brush off on me." I thought that was the oddest thing ever. I couldn't have been 5, 6 years old. And, that has stuck with me. You love going to your grandmother's house and stuff like this, but you see that delineation of racism that goes from generation to generation, and each generation doesn't recognize it. The whole George Floyd thing still resonates in our minds. We thought we had come so far, and we have not. There were things that came out from political races over the last 4 to 8 years that showed me a face of America that I didn't think I knew it existed somewhat. I thought it existed in the South. I didn't realize it existed as violently as it existed across the country. When we talk about the Dr. King thing, we're talking about 50 years, and you think that we've moved a long way. We hadn't. When I was in high school, there was a girl running for student council president. She was a senior. Her name was Sandra, and I can't remember her last name. She was an African-American lady running for student council president. The school had never had a female as a student council president. School never had a black. And she was running against a member of the football team. Odds did not look good. I don't even know how I knew Sandra being a sophomore, her being a senior, but she asked if I would be her campaign manager just because I have some artistic talent. And I think I can paint banners and posters. I think it's the reason why I got the job. And it was fun. And we had a whole campaign and put posters and stuff throughout the hallways and everything like this. And she did end up winning, believe it or not. It was pretty incredible. Nobody but she had a good campaign manager, is why. I remember she said, if I win, my parents said that I could have a party at my house to celebrate. And so I went home and mentioned that to my mother. And she said, "I'm not sure if I'm comfortable you going." She knew why she wasn't comfortable with me going. I said to her, I'm sure it came across as disrespectful. I said, "You're a racist, aren't you? Because you're concluding that Sandra lives in a more dangerous neighborhood than we live in, or lives in a worse neighborhood than we live in." And I said, "You don't know that Sandra and her parents don't live in Pleasant Valley, and he's a banker or a doctor, a heart surgeon." And we had a great conversation about it. She concluded, kind of the same way that we've talked at the early part of this, that just things that run through her mind have racist connotations, and we allow ourselves to let those things just run through our minds and our mouths without realizing that they really are racist. We can wash it any way we want to wash it. We can say, no, it's not a hatred. It's just not appropriate. Same thing. It's not appropriate because it's a hatred. Probably the more interesting thing, Gene, is when I went to work at K97 in 85, because then I was one of two Caucasian people at a radio station, which was like the most fun job ever. But every remote we went to at a shopping center or at a car dealership, the customers who came were 80%, maybe 90% Black. And all my coworkers, it was probably 95% Black. I wasn't mistreated. It was just a different world for me. I now go to work every day in a place where I am a vast minority, and I had never in my life been a minority. Their conversations, because of life experiences, were different. I was marketing director. This is exactly when rap music was coming about. I remember Run DMC coming to the radio station, and it was like the first rap group I'd ever seen in my life. They were beginning to see more young white teenagers listening to the radio station because it was this rebellious Black music, which is so bizarre because now working at a museum that teaches about the birth of rock and roll in Memphis, Tennessee, and how it totally involved white teenagers listening to Black music. And then I had the opportunity to experience that again in the 80s when rap and hip hop came along, and it was white kids listening to Black music because it was rhythmic, because it was different than what their parents had listened to. It was because their parents hated it. It's almost an exact mirror of what happened in the 1950s. So they said, our audience is growing because now whites are listening to us. And so we would like to get the radio station into some of the big events around town because we're the number one station. We've been the number one station. The whole time I worked there, it was the number one station. And so common sense would say to me, if it's the number one station, then we can be the official radio station of anything we want to be the official radio station of. But you can't. Why can't you? Nobody's going to talk about it. And they, through a car dealership, had worked out a car giveaway for an on-air contest when radio stations used to do big on-air contests. They asked me if I'd find a place to do the grand finale where people come and try their key in the car, and if their key starts the car, they win the car. And so I went to the most popular mall in town, and they said, "Oh, we would love to, but our promotional calendar is booked then." And I said, "Well, you don't know when then is. I hadn't told you when we're going to do the giveaway, and we'll be flexible with your calendar, so we can do it anytime." And they said, "Yeah, but we've got a lot on our calendar." I said, "Well, what if we do such and such?" And they said, "Yeah, I just don't really think it's going to work." I didn't say anything because I was meeting with a client who wasn't advertising much on the radio station. And I said to him, "You don't have to advertise. We're not asking for dollars. You don't have to buy a single spot. You'll be included in 500 promotional spots. All we need is a place on a Saturday or a Sunday to do the car giveaway." "Yeah, I just don't think it's going to work." And it dawned on me. I immediately knew why they didn't want it to happen. They didn't want folks that look like you to come piling into the mall. And I don't think I can just celebrate the fun parts of culture without understanding a culture, which isn't always the fun parts of it. I don't know if it's K97 radio. I don't know if it's working for an international festival or having worked here and seeing people from all over the world come through this museum to learn about rock and roll and soul music, which has a story that many of them haven't heard before. Black musicians who wrote lyrics and melodies to songs, never received royalties, and all of a sudden a good-looking white kid records the song and it becomes a hit. And I can't tell you how many times in my adult life that I have heard a song by the Black Crowes or Rolling Stones or whoever, and then there was one that was by Otis Redding that I heard in the museum one day, and I was like, that's like a Rolling Stone song. And they said, no, it's Otis Redding song. The Rolling Stones recorded it. I never had a clue. I learned about Blind Lemon Jefferson, who wrote lyrics that were then recorded by Arthur Crudup, who were then recorded by Elvis Presley. And we're talking about That's All Right, Mama. And it became one of the biggest hits of his career. We have no idea, we meaning white people, we have no idea who those other two people are, and have no understanding that they never received royalties at all. Big Mama Thornton, who wrote and recorded Hound Dog, but then Elvis re-recorded Hound Dog, she didn't receive the royalties. She didn't, she was never inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Do we need to push the pendulum too far in one direction in order for it to hopefully end up back at level so that all things are equal? And then you're going to have someone bring up affirmative action where you're required to hire this many people of color, and how that's wrong because whites are losing jobs because you're required to hire a person of color. Yeah, I can say that's wrong. I can also say it's wrong that for how many decades did we not hire people of color because they were people of color? Again, I'll go back to my college days to where I worked at a small graphic print shop and advertising agency, and they were looking to hire someone new as a salesperson. Interviewed this African-American lady, and afterwards I asked the owner's wife how the interview went, and she said it went fine, but we're not going to hire her because she's Black. There you go. Nothing else happened. And we don't understand that. I'm no one special, Gene. This is the way I just stumble my way through life, and I think about these kinds of things and talk about them and have a job that deals with it that I enjoy very much and stuff like this. I've always said I'm more scared of a white person who claims that they're not racist than I am of a white person that claims that they're racist. A white person who claims they're racist, and they know what they are. They are as transparent as anything. The one that's scary is the person who says they're not a racist because there's no transparency there. And I think if anytime we stop struggling with that, then we become worse.
I'm glad we're having this conversation, Don, because I know that's what attracted me to you. When I first met you last year around this time, you think outside the box. You refuse to be put in a box with the way you want to view things and the way you want to use your time and your energy. It really intrigued me. And like I told you, I could listen to you for hours. You're so humble. And what you say makes a lot of sense. I mean, if we had more people thinking that way, we'd be in better shape.
That's polite for you to say. I'm not anything special or different. I might be curious and wish more people would be that way so that they would meet that neighbor that they didn't want moving into their neighborhood and just get to know them. You just think about countries that live every day with, I might not live 3 more days because my home might be bombed, or someone with grenades strapped to them might blow it up in a mall that I go to or something like that. And we're definitely seeing more of that in the United States just because, whatever reason, that could be a whole nother discussion. But I always thought, why didn't people want to live the way we live here in the United States, to where you just like people, even though we don't always like people? But I don't see anything wrong with that. You draw conclusions about, I don't like Latinos, or I don't like Middle Eastern people, or I don't like Muslims, or I don't like blacks, or I don't like whites, or whatever the case might be. So much more interesting if you just learn about the people who live in the city that you live in and get to know them. And you don't have to celebrate their culture, but how cool is it to know their culture and to know what it's about and stuff like that?
Well, you know what? That's going to be the message of this podcast. Why can't we just do that? I don't think anything embodies you more than this discussion. I wanted it to come out organically, and this is you, man.
Yeah, it is. It is. We're all very different people, and there's nothing wrong with getting to know different people. And I appreciate you taking time to do that. I mean, I'm no one special. I do have a fun job because I get to work at a rock and roll soul museum, which is cool as can be, and love the city that I live in, and hope that everybody that hears this podcast comes to Memphis. We don't get along all the time, but most of the time we do, and we celebrate things together. We celebrate soul food and barbecue because we all love to eat. It's a fun city, and it's because, for the most part, many days we put aside those racist tendencies that live within us and just are Memphians, or just our people.
Memphis is going to be my next destination point. I love Memphis, never been there, but you made me want to go.
It gets a lot of hard knocks. We have poverty in this city because a whole lot of people that make up the population of Memphis have not gotten a fair shake through their whole lives, and the lives of their parents and the lives of their grandparents. The balance isn't even. And so we turn our head and disregard people that are struggling. Everybody in the whole world is looking to hire people because of shortage of employees because of the pandemic. There's still some of those people that live in Memphis, Tennessee that aren't going to be given a job simply because of the color of their skin. And so it's not a dangerous city. It's a city that struggles because of all of us in the whole entire country, that we have not fixed this thing that has been such a black eye of our country for so many decades and centuries. Anytime you take everything away from people, anytime you give no opportunities for people, people are going to reach a point in order to take care of their families and in order to take care of themselves. They're going to do dire things. And sometimes someone's going to take out a gun and they're going to go rob a 7-Eleven. By looking at people as people and not looking at people as a color, then we'd fix some of those things. They can label the city whatever they want to. It is one of the greatest cities in the world.
Can you give the website address, because there is a few letters missing that people may assume?
Absolutely. The museum's name is very strange because it's the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum. The simplest way is rockinsoul.org. Rock like rock music, the letter N like Nancy, soul like soul music.org.
Well, I have to say, like, you have the most soul of any white person I ever met, John.
Well, opportunities. It's all about opportunity. And I'm no different than anybody else. If anyone else would open themselves to opportunities, same kind of thing happened. But the greatest thing in life that happened, I had no idea at the time. I was just going to school. But opportunity to go to a school with people like me and people not like me, going to jobs where there were people like me and people not like me. That's all it is. If we open ourselves to embracing people like us and people not like us, then yeah, you become a different person.
Man, that's going to be the final word, John, because I can't top that.